Can you see the white space?
Yes, Doc.
Yeah.
I want to talk about effects of width density. So it's the effect of width density on the crop yields. Now I can demonstrate this using a graph. Now on the y-axis, on the x-axis, we are going to have a width density. Or we can call it dW. Then here we've got yield. Yeah, I want you to divide this. So I've got A and B. This is B. Right. If we focus on A, we've got a width density going this direction and yield in this direction on the y-axis. Now, if we plot a graph showing what is happening to our yield as we increase density, according to some weed scientists, they think density can do this. Now, if we increase width density, you get a sort of an S-shaped graph, which is almost slanted. Now, this kind of a graph, we call it a sigmoid curve. Now, this was actually proposed by a weed scientist known as Zimbabwe. In 1980. So what they said was that if you increase width density, at first, when you have low width density, the yield doesn't seem to decrease until you reach a certain point. Then yield starts going down very fast. Then you reach another density where again the losses are decreased. And you can represent this decrease in yield with a curve known as a Sigmoid curve. And this was proposed by Zimbabwe. Now I want to look at a situation where we are looking at the loss. And this is probably too close. Let me a bit. Now I want to draw a second graph showing yield loss. And yield loss, we can represent it as a percentage. Now, according to Zimdar, when you plot weed density versus yield loss, when you have, this is 0. When you have low yields, your losses are low. If you've got a low weed density, you've got the yield loss is quite low. Then as you increase weed density, you also start to increase yield loss, and you may get something like this, which is also a sigmoid curve describing the loss. Now, what is interesting is that here, it appears there is very little loss. But when we reach this point, the loss is now increasing up to this. Then it stabilizes around this area. Now, what Zimdar suggested was that there's a certain density which is not harmful to crops. And he was proposing that it is this part here. All the weeds in this direction from 0 up to here, we are not having losses. So if we can mark this, so in other words, if you were managing weeds, as long as the weed population or the weed density is around here, probably there's no need to weed control. And Zimdar and other scientists, they gave a special name to this weed density, which doesn't seem to be affecting crops or crop yield. They called this density weed control threshold. So this density of weeds, which gives low yield loss, was referred to as weed control threshold. In other words, there's a density which is very special, if we know it, which can tell us when to start weeding or when to impose weed control, or we may choose not to control weeds. And this is what is termed the weed control threshold. You can only obtain the weed control threshold by plotting a graph showing weed density plotted against yield loss. Then you get this sort of a graph, and this can be used as a management tool to tell farmers whether to weed or not using this special graph. So we can tell the position of weed control threshold according to Zimbabwe. Now, there are other scientists who think that probably this shape is not representing the actual situation. And they think that probably this could be misleading. But there are a group of scientists who think this can be used in weed management. So let us look at the other situation. We will still plot yield versus weed density and yield loss versus weed density. So again, we want to determine the effects of weeds, effect of weed density on yield. Down here, we have got weed density. So on the y-axis, we've got crop yield. This is graph A. And this is graph B. Okay. So let us call the
Asi magetsi aenda zvekare.
Ndoona sekudari.
Vabuda. Mana.
But this one is it's a 3-hour lecture. Avakangani.
It's supposed to be a 3-hour lecture.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know, but those of I attended some of my lectures. I that time a group which won't be enough. It's like 3 hours.
Such a fun of person at 12.
Or even one.
Ha, guys.
amuchaonika.
Hachakuonei.
Ari kudzaitigadzirisa.
Okay.
Graph rekutanga mamariona here.
Yeah.
Let me start sharing again. Because ndazoona kuti ndaandega.
Tasarawo tega.
Let me try to share. Oh, okay. Are you seeing anything?
Yes.
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 Right. This one, we had seen it.
Yes, Doc.
Okay. So I'm now explaining this according to Cousins. Now, according to Cousins, with the Zimdal, the graph is a sigmoid curve. If you are looking at the yield, as you are increasing density, at first, the yield is not decreasing. Until you reach a certain point, then it starts decreasing. Again, if you look at the yield loss, when you increase with density, at first, there's no loss. But as you continue increasing yield loss, as you continue increasing with density, then the yield loss suddenly it's now increasing until it reaches a certain point. Now, with the Cousins, what he proposed was that with yield loss, as long as you have widths, you are going to get crop yield being reduced. And he proposed that this is what is actually happening. There's no point where you have this is stagnation. It starts right here. So this is according to Cousins. And when you look at the yield loss, it starts straight away as long as you have width, there's a loss. And you have this like that. So here's the difference in the way the scientists look at it. Some think it's this sigmoid curve. Others think that you get, straight away yield is decreasing. Now, if we look at Cousins' yield loss curve, we get two special points. This point which we can represent it by A, it's known as the maximum yield loss. Then we have got a slope which is here. Now this slope is represented by I. So on Cousins' graph, which is this one, which is just showing yield, crop yield versus width density, you get this straight graph. When you look at the yield loss on the y-axis and density on the x-axis, you get this curve, which has got two special points, A, which is maximum yield loss, and this I, which is the slope. Now, Cousins actually proposed a sort of a relationship of linking the yield to these two parameters, maximum yield loss and the slope. Now, what he proposed was that if we represent yield by Y, this is yield loss. He said we can actually relate yield loss to this slope and the maximum yield loss like this. We can say yield loss is equal to slope multiplied by density. Density is here, which I have represented by dW. So dW, so it will be slope multiplied by its dW, which is density. This is going to be divided by 1 plus, again, this portion slope multiplied by dW over A. This is in brackets. So Cousin could express the equation which estimate yield loss like this. He took the slope and the density and multiplied these two. Divided by, again, this term, slope and density, which is now here. And this was divided by the maximum yield loss. So this factor is added to 1. This is how you can get your yield loss. Now, if we compare these two graphs with these ones, on Zimbabwe curve, we can clearly see this one, the width control threshold. But when we come to cousins, it appears there's no threshold. Everything is starting at 0. But if we wanted to implement this for management purposes, the farm manager will have to think about estimating a loss which is not serious on a farm. Some managers may say 1% is okay. Others may say 5% is okay. So let's suppose we propose 1% as yield loss. What we will just do is to come here and put 1% here. and try to solve this equation so that we get dW, which is equivalent to 1%. That density becomes our width control threshold. It's not clear on the graph like the previous one. Here we have to use this equation in order to get the width control threshold. In most cases, farm managers use this 5% as the percentage which they can allow. And on this graph, if we come to the graph and mark 5%, it will lead us to this density of width, which becomes our width control threshold. Okay, so this becomes our width control threshold. With the cousins, it's clear. You can see this flattening on the graph where the loss starts to pick up. Then you can mark, and you are now aware that this is your width control threshold. But here you have to estimate by judging whether 5% is okay, or 1%, or 2%. You come to your graph, then you read the density. And that density is the one which you say this is the width control threshold. Or you can come into this equation and substitute y with the 5% and solve this equation to get dW. Of course, you'll be knowing the slope as well as the maximum yield loss. Now, there is a problem when implementing this model or these graphs in order to manage your widths, or you want these graphs to tell you when to start weeding, depending on the density. Now, sometimes weeds can emerge ahead of the crop. Now, in the case where you are having weeds which emerge before the crops, this equation, this model is not going to work. So Cousins had to modify it. He had to ensure that this one had to be modified. So what he did was that if we start with his equation, yield is equal to slope, which is I dW divided by 1 plus I dW divided by maximum yield loss, which was A. And everything here is in brackets. Now, Cousin's problem with this equation was here. Because if weeds are emerging ahead of the crop, then this whole equation becomes misleading. So he had to modify here. Instead, he put an E instead of 1, he put an E, which was raised to the power of T, of C, multiplied by T. Now, this E is actually a log, which they call natural logarithm. So this one is natural log and the C is just a constant. And the T is time of weed seedling emergence. Now, once Cousins had done this, the equation became useful, especially when you have weeds which emerge ahead of the crop. You could predict yield losses. But of course, one has to count the weeds. Now, there are some people who proposed that the use of weed density probably it's not, it's cumbersome and it may not be very appropriate. They proposed what they called relative leaf area. So what they did was to propose they looked at effect of relative leaf area. What they did was to try and relate crop yield loss to the area of weeds as well as the crop. So they defined what is known as the relative leaf area. So relative leaf area. Equals to they measured the leaf area of the weeds and found the leaf area index. So they also found leaf area index of the crop and added this to the leaf area of the weeds. So this is what they related to crop yield loss. So first you need to measure leaf area of the weeds. Then you also need leaf area of the crop. And of course, you add this to the leaf area of the weeds. Then you find this ratio is what you call the relative leaf area. This was actually proposed by a scientist known as Peters. So Croft and Spitters proposed this. So let us look at what sort of graph we get if we plot crop yield loss versus the relative leaf area. So on the x-axis, let us put a relative leaf area. And we represent it by arrow W. Here we've got yield loss. So when they plotted the yield loss, they also got this shape. By the way, this shape is known as a rectangular hyperbola. I will let me. This shape, we call it rectangular hyperbola. Both, these curves. So they also got this rectangular hyperbola. Okay, so that is the name of this shape. It had also two interesting positions. This one and this one. Here we still have our maximum yield loss, but this slope they decided to call it P. So they decided to call it Q, sorry. So we now have A and Q. Q is the slope, and A is the maximum yield loss. And our x-axis is the relative leaf area, which is LW. So they put an equation to estimate yield loss. So according to them, yield loss, which is Y, maybe let me write in black. Yield loss, that is Y, representing this yield loss is equal to now they multiplied the slope and the relative leaf area. So here we have a Q multiplied by LW, which is the relative leaf area. And we are going to divide this by 1 plus or in brackets they now divided this Q is Q over A. This A is taken from here, it's now coming here. Then they subtracted 1. Then everything is in brackets. Then this whole term, Q over A, which is, this is the slope, divided by maximum yield loss minus 1, or in brackets, again multiplied by relative leaf area. Now, this equation could now predict yield loss. What they said was that this was better than Cousin's approach because time if weeds emerge ahead of the crop, this leaf area is a robust system. You cannot get erroneous predictions of yield loss by measuring a leaf area. But of course, the drawback is measuring leaf area itself may be time consuming, and it may not be easy. But this era of time of weed seedling emergence is removed by this system. But you still get the rectangular hyperbola. But of course, measuring leaf area is probably the drawback. So they also suggested that you could actually estimate what they called relative cover as a substitute for leaf area. So if we draw another before drawing another graph, a relative cover now, relative cover is that you can just walk into a field and just estimate the area covered by the weeds. And
Pana kamogera.
right, I had lost the connection. Are we all in?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Yeah, let me share again the same. Can you see?
Yes, Doc.
Right. So relative cover could be represented. You just go into a field Then assess. If you think there are 50%, the area is covered by 50% weeds, 30%, 90%, 100%, it's up to you. The crop, is it 40%, 30%? Then you add it to the estimation for area covered by the weeds. And this expression gives you a relative cover, which you may call it RC. Let us call this RC. So this is one which we are going to plot against yield loss. So if we quickly draw another graph, now we have RC here. Then here we have got our yield loss. And we still get this rectangular hyperbola. We still have our A here, maximum yield loss. And we have our Q here, right? So according to Croft and Spitters, you could then express the yield loss like this: Y equals to Q multiplied by RC. Everything is divided by 1 plus or in brackets, we have got Q over A minus 1, everything in brackets, then multiplied by RC. Instead of putting a relative leaf area here, we are now putting a relative cover. And again, this equation can be used to predict yield loss. So what we have just done is to relate crop yield loss number one, we can relate it to weed density. Now, if we relate it to width density, we have seen Zimdar approach and the Cousins approach. Now, according to Zimdar, there are some width densities which doesn't affect the crop yield. But according to Cousins, as long as you have width, you have yield loss. And it appears the Cousins approach is commonly used to estimate crop yield losses due to width. Now, we say that probably width density may not be easy. Croft and Spitters suggested use of relative leaf area. Leaf area. They also found that probably relative leaf area is cumbersome to measure. And you can also relate crop yield loss to relative cover, RC. So we now have three approaches. It's either you go in the field, you count the weeds, then using that graph of Cousins or the equations, you can now estimate yield loss. Or if you have got the instruments and the time, you actually go and measure leaf area, which is very accurate. But you can simply walk into a field and estimate RC, relative cover, which is very simple to estimate. I've seen some students who were very quick in using RC to estimate yield losses. And there were no differences with the actually counting weeds. Counting weeds was, very cumbersome than relative cover. So I just thought I needed to explain some of these concepts. Now I will move on to the type of experiment which can use this, or the type of study which can use these three approaches. So I will stop sharing this bit. Anyway, any questions? Are you there?
Hi, Doc.
Yeah. So what I tried to do is to explain some of these concepts so that when I explain them in the experiments, which are used to estimate yield losses, it becomes easy. So I'm going to show you, we are going to move on to some slides where I'm going to explain some of the experiments which were used to estimate crop yield losses. So there are a number of studies which can be done in order to understand the effect of weed density on crop yield. We have about 5 research designs which have been used to study the effects of weeds on crops. The first designs are known as the additive designs. Then we have number 2, we have got a replacement series. 3, we have got a addition series or response surface. Then number 4, we have got the dial. And 5, the neighborhood experiments. All these 5 approaches deal with the weed density. And the aim of such studies is just to understand how weed density influence crop yields. And the information which can be derived from such studies could be used in weed management. So how weeds actually affect crops is a difficult subject. And there are no agreements in some of the approaches among scientists, as you will later appreciate as we discuss these issues. If you find some designs being difficult to understand, this is their nature. Some of them are not used because they are too complicated for practical purposes. So we are going to start by the additive designs. Now, in additive experiments, the sort of research questions or what you want to understand or what you want to find out is this. You may have these questions. For example, we want to know the minimum weed density which can justify weed control. If we see weeds in a field, do we just go and weed, or we weed when we think it is necessary? So there's a certain density which can warrant weed control. Remember, use of herbicides or any other weed control technologies may cost money. The other issue we want to look at is what is the most competitive weed? Because weeds can differ in terms of competition. We may also want to understand the crop yield loss itself. So if we want to get these questions answered, we have to use the additive experiments. Now I will move on to explain how we can go about conducting additive experiments. This slide, which you are seeing, is actually an example of an additive experiment where we were determining the effect of Rapoko grass on the maize. So we varied the Rapoko grass density and we were measuring the effects on the maize crop. And this can be done using pots. You can see here we've got pots with the maize and the different amounts of Rapoko grass. And what we simply do, we can conduct this kind of study for 8 weeks. At the end of 8 weeks, we just harvest maize biomass and do some estimations to get yield loss and relate it to weed density. We have also used Tithonia rotundifolia. This is a weed which is now encroaching the agricultural fields. We wanted to understand its loss, its impact on maize yield loss. So you can see maize and Tithonia. You could have seen this plant somewhere. So the method, now what you simply do is to vary weed density. And you can do this using pots. You know, you put different numbers of weeds in the pots. Now you should have some pots without weeds. Then you can have 2 weeds per plant, 4, 6, 8, probably up to 12. But the crop density is constant. So you have probably 1 plant representing the crop within the pots. And these treatments can be replicated either 4 times or 6 times. If it's a pot experiment, it may be better to have 6 replications. This would be in randomized complete block design or RCBD. I'm sure you are doing this in statistics or completely randomized designs. Now, what you can measure is crop height, crop biomass, leaf area, and weed biomass. Now, once you have got this data, you now use graphs and probably regression analysis so that you can get to your yield loss. Now, you may find that some researchers have used tables in these kind of studies. Sometimes tables are not very useful. Now we have got different sort of relationships. The relationship I talked about when I was explaining the graphs is 4 and 5. The hyperbolic curve, which you now know, which was proposed by Cousins, and the sigmoid curve in number 5, which we started with, which was proposed by Zimbabwe. But otherwise, you can also get, if you plot weed density versus crop yield loss, you may get a linear response, or you may get a quadratic response, or an exponential curve. This depends on the number of your treatments. But I'm just displaying possible relationships. But 4 and 5 are the common ones. Now, what is the effect of weed density on crop yield? Now, we want to get the weed density, which justifies weed control. So what is the weed density which justifies control of weeds in order to avoid the economic yield loss? The other question is, should we monitor weed populations in cropping fields in order to plan weed control programs? I suppose if we're going to use weed populations, we definitely need to understand the relationship between weed density and the crop yield loss. Well, is the weed density the best tool for predicting crop yield loss? Because sometimes we are studying one weed at a time. And when you are in a real situation, there are a lot of weeds in a given field. So what you are saying, if we use one weed in a study, does this give us a good estimate of crop yield loss? Well, which I was just saying in number 4. We've got so many weed species. If we concentrate on one weed, do we get a better answer? Number 3, weed density. Are there other measurements like maybe leaf area, relative cover? So this was what I was trying to explain earlier on. If you have got crop yield versus weed density, you get a sort of an S-shaped graph, which is the sigmoid curve, which was proposed by Zimbabwe. And when you plot crop yield loss versus weed density, you also get this sort of curve, which is sigmoid. And at the early stages, the yield loss is very small. You can almost point what we call the weed control threshold. However, Cousins proposed that instead of having this sort of relationship, probably this is more realistic. If we have weed density versus crop yield, as long as you have weeds, you start having a reduction in crop yield, and it follows this rectangular hyperbola. That is the name of the curve. And if you were plotting crop yield loss versus density, you get again a rectangular hyperbola, which you can identify the maximum yield loss by A and the slope, which is I. In 1985, Cousins proposed this yield loss equation, which we're trying to understand, saying yield loss is equal to IW. I is the slope. This is DW is the density, all divided by 1 plus everything in the brackets. IDW divided by A, like what I was trying to explain. This graph which you are seeing was developed by a student who was studying the effect of Tithonia rotundifolia density on maize yield. So this is what he got. This is yield loss. This is the density of tithonia. And after plotting, he got this sort of curve. We can estimate A and I on this graph. So, according to this graph, the A is here, which is 64%. The slope is 1.48. So using these, you can actually estimate yield loss. This is a graph which was done by Chivinge and Rukuni using Brassica napas and Oxalis latifolia, which is the weed. So they were increasing the weed density, and this is the yield. This is the yield, which is decreasing. But if you look at the loss, it conforms to the Cousins graph. So Oxalis latifolia density versus yield loss. Again, another study using a weed. The yield loss is also a rectangular hyperbola. And we said that time of weed seedling emergence makes this equation erroneous. It doesn't predict well the yield loss. So Cousins had to adjust this one. So he substituted one with a natural logarithms, which was raised to the power of a constant multiplied by time of weed seedling emergence. Once Cousins had done this to the equation, it became very useful to predict yield loss. Now, these are some weeds which were studied by various researchers, and we have got the A and I values of these weeds. The A representing the maximum yield loss, and I representing the slope. What you are saying is that if you take data across weeds in various crops, which could be a lot of work, you can actually characterize the weed competitive abilities. I mean, you can characterize these weeds according to weed competitive abilities. And they have different competitive abilities. So you can have this weed has got this maximum yield loss and this slope for a certain crop. So you can see Amaranthus hybridus in probably soybean and maize may differ in terms of competitive ability. So the A and I values may differ across crops, which may mean a lot of information. So what we are saying is that if we knew the competitive abilities of the weeds in various crops, maybe there are some weeds which are not supposed to be removed from the fields because they don't damage our crops. But if we don't have this information, we are just going to kill these weeds, and it's costly. Now, this is the approach which was used by Croft and Spitters in 1991. Instead of using weed density, they used relative leaf area, and this is how they obtained their relative leaf area. You actually measure the area of the leaves and get leaf area index. You do the same with the crop. Then we have this ratio where you have leaf area index of the weed divided by leaf area index of the crop plus leaf area index of the wheat. Then you relate this to your crop yield loss. And these authors had resolved the problem of time of weed seedling emergence because it can cause problems in predicting yield losses. Now, when they plotted the graph, there's the Q and A, like what we were trying to demonstrate. And this is how you can predict yield loss. Okay, it's the same equation where we have relative leaf area and we are trying to predict yield loss. But this Q in their equation, they call it slope or a relative damage coefficient. But we said it may be cumbersome to try to measure leaf area. You can just estimate relative cover, where relative cover is the area of the weeds plus area of the weeds divided by the area of the weeds plus the area of the crop, like what we were trying to explain. And this can be plotted where you have the crop yield loss versus the relative cover, and you have this equation where you substitute relative leaf area with the relative cover. It's the same equation with the relative cover. I found that students found this one easy to estimate crop yield loss. They would simply go into a field, estimate relative cover, try to see what is happening to the crop, and produce estimates. They were comparing relative cover and wheat counts. Now, if you want to understand this process, you can read this paper by Cousins. It's a simple model relating yield loss to width density. I may have to give you this paper. It may be difficult to find. So if you need it, I will give you so that you can read. It will explain what I was trying to explain. The other one which relate, this one focuses on width density and related to yield loss. This one focuses on relative leaf area and related to crop yield loss. I mean, one has to choose the approach which he or she thinks is better, depending on the resources. This other paper is predicting rice yield loss. This is actually in a natural field with multi-species, where we have many weeds, like what we always see in the field. Is trying to incorporate various methods. Cousins approach, Spitter's, Croft and Spitter's approach are also tested in this paper. The good thing is that this paper is describing a situation which we see in the actual fields. And these authors found that these equations could be useful in predicting yield loss in rice. And they could be used as management tools in weed management. This is also another paper which is using weed density, relative time of weed emergence, and relative leaf area. So it is using Cousin's equation, which is corrected, and comparing it with the leaf area, which was proposed by Croft and Spitters. If you have time, you may read it and see which is better. We do have other references which you may also look at in order to understand the additive design. Now, I just want to briefly talk about the disadvantages of additive designs. One disadvantage is that crop biomass varies with the species proportion and density. What we are doing is that we are actually increasing the population of weeds. And as a result, we are actually increasing density and altering the proportion. In statistics, they say we have confounded, we are confounding the two factors. There's confounding or mixing of the two, and you cannot separate them. Proportion and density. Because proportion and density both influence crop biomass. So it's in statistics, this becomes a problem. The other thing is that the competitiveness of the crop remains unknown in such kind of a study, although we may know the competitive ability of the wheat, because we can express it as A, the maximum yield loss, or I, the slope. Those two values can characterize the competitive ability of the crop, of the wheat. But we will not know the competitive ability of the crop. Now, in this study, additive design, there is competition. There are two types of competition. Maize can compete with, weeds can compete among themselves. That is intra-specific competition. Then you have competition between the weeds and the crop, which is interspecific competition. This additive design does not separate the two. And also it becomes a problem. Here I've got a slide of a student who was doing an additive design here at UZ, working with the maize and this with Tithonia, wild red sunflower. You can see this is the weed which is almost, you cannot see the maize. It competes for light. This is in Murewa, where we're having this Tithonia. It's now starting to invade the agricultural fields. That was why we wanted to determine its competitive effects. Now, the use of weed control thresholds in Southern Africa or even in Africa, there's very little research which has been done to establish various weed control thresholds in crops. In fact, we are not using it as a management tool because we don't know these weed control thresholds. Now, during summer, we may have the first flush of weeds. Normally, we have high densities of weeds after the onset of rains. And probably these first flush of weeds exceed the weed control thresholds. Therefore, weeding is always necessary. Because after the onset of rains, probably there's no situation where farmers will say maybe these weeds are not, do not justify weed control. But there are some farmers who after the first rains, they plow their fields and destroy the first flush of weeds. When they plant with the second flush of weeds, probably these conditions may have weeds which are below the weed control thresholds. Now, in winter cereals, the widths which emerge seem to be below weed control thresholds, because there are certain areas in the high veld who may not actually weed wheat, because it may not be necessary. But in the low veld where it is hot, probably the weed control thresholds can be achieved. And you need to apply some herbicides to control weeds in the winter wheat. So if we do additive experiments, we want to establish weed control thresholds. Then we can use weed control thresholds as a tool for weed management, because we can decide whether to put herbicides or whether not to control the weeds. I'm going to stop here. Hello?
Hello, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Yes. I think we should stop here. After discussing these additive designs, I tried to draw some graphs to explain the relationship of weed density and yield loss, then relative leaf area and weed loss, and then relative cover and yield loss. Which approach do you think is better? To go and count weeds, or simply to go into a field and estimate percentage cover?
As for me, I think just go and estimate the cover. It's good than going and counting the weeds.
I think if you read one of the papers estimating yield loss in rice, the figures they collected, they actually found that relative cover was more robust than counting weeds and measuring leaf area. Yet it was very simple to do it. So you may read it if you want. Yes.
There's a device that was designed measure leaf area index. Aikwanisire kushandiswa for measuring the relative cover.
Yes. I think it can be used. Is it very fast?
That one is very, very fast.
Yeah, I think if you have got such equipment, then I think it can be used.
Okay.
Yeah. What I wanted to, I don't know, because we started from 9, isn't it?
Yes.
I thought we would stop here, then on Monday we pick it up.
It's okay, Doc.
We discuss other other designs.
Always will.
I don't know. Or you want us to proceed?
No, it's okay. We can do on Monday. But can we start at 10 on Monday, Doc?
It's up to you. Yeah, it's up to you. We can start anytime. I mean, is this agreeable with everybody?
Yeah, 10 is still good.
Right.
Yeah, I remember with another group, we were scheduled to start at 9. Do you know what time we started always?
Mm.
It was 10. But
No.
with you, I mean, because we are few, I think we can schedule it for 10.
Okay, Doc.
Okay.
And we see how we proceed. But
Okay.
are you having any problems with the graphs or?
I don't know, Doc. Is there any reference material that you can give us to read in our extra time?
We're using those papers which I was displaying.
I didn't note them down.
Yeah, I can always, send you the information. In fact, after this, because we are not going to lose anything, I will send you the record.
Okay. Thank you.
Not only the record, I'll also send you the PowerPoint.
Okay. Thank you, Doc.
So on the PowerPoint, you will see the references which you may want to read. If you don't find a certain reference, especially the cousins one, I may just put it on WhatsApp.
Yeah, you can send on WhatsApp.
Yeah, I'll put them on WhatsApp.
Thank you, Doc.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
So this is Friday. I think we should just stop.
Yeah,
You
3 hours is a long time.
you may have other things to do.
Some of us at work.
Oh yeah, at work, yeah. After finishing this recording, I will send it. I will need your emails.
We can send them on the group if you don't mind.
Yes. Yeah. Once I get your emails, then I can send this recording. Is there somebody who can edit? I'm not gonna go edit our recording in this group.
Nah, ndigoni.
Can I not go?
Okay, and
Edit.
we'll try to get them edited. But yes,
Edit.
no, just send the Mari raw.
You want them to be edited, so you remove what, Doc?
You may find that there are certain times when I'm trying to sort something, and when you are playing it, you don't find anything.
Mm.
Yeah. You have to be patient because there will be big gaps sometimes.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, I will see you on Monday.
Thank you, Doc. See you on Monday.
Enjoy your weekend.
Okay.